Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, a digital space where we explore the Catholic intellectual tradition. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, and I'm joined this week by my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy for Catholic Studies Academy. Today we'll be talking about Catholicism and the political life, particularly in the contemporary American context as it pertains to our practical responsibilities in terms of supporting political agendas, advancing party platforms, and voting. Although I'm sure that our discussion will be pretty well transferable to most 21st century democratic republics and parliamentary systems throughout Western culture. So, Dr. Smith, as it turns out, you've done quite a lot of work in political philosophy over the course of your career. Not only your doctoral dissertation at the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, but also in the book you published in 2020 with St. John's Books, Understanding Modern Political Ideas. So why don't you just get us started today?
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, so it's a was the ancient curse, may you live in interesting times, right? We certainly
Yeah.
do live in interesting times when it comes to politics. It seems to be getting like more interesting each time, each cycle. It
Every
feels like
time you
this
wake up
is
in the morning, it's a little more
yeah,
interesting than it
right.
was when you went to
You
bed.
know, each election cycle feels like, man, this is the most momentous one, and then it's only capped by the next one, right?
Right.
But if you just think about the recent events that we've been through, just even within the last 6 months or last 3 months, I guess, or
Hmm.
before, um, we've had probably one of the most consequential presidential debates, where, one of the presidential candidates, Joe Biden, showed his cognitive inability to serve as president, right?
Hmm.
That came out very clearly. There was already suspicions about that, but that came out very clearly. Then we had an assassination attempt on a former president and current major competitor for the presidency, right? An assassination attempt that, I mean, it's important to press this, was less than a half inch away from probably killing him,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if you look at the
Right.
trajectory, at least of and this is included in mainstream sources, look at the trajectory of the bullet, really just millimeters.
Yeah. There's no question he would have been killed had he not turned his head at just the right time.
That's right. Yeah. So it's just remarkable. Um, and then, of course, we have the resignation then shortly after of President Biden from the presidential race, right? Still holds the presidency, but resigned. Now, he didn't say in his resignation due to cognitive deficiency. He sort of said it was time to pass the torch, kind of, right?
Right.
But he was certainly under a lot of pressure. There's interesting stories. I won't be too speculative, but it seems like he was pretty much forced into that decision by members of his own party. Then we have the rapid rise of Kamala Harris and her running mate, Tim Walz, two unpopular candidates, especially politicians, especially Kamala. Um, but, rise and then sort of rapidly becomes super popular, right?
Hmm.
In a sort of almost extraordinary way. You have the controversial vice presidential nomination of J.D. Vance. And then, of course, you have the Catholic response to all of this, which has been, we'll say, sort of mixed and sometimes odd.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, just a lot here to deal with. I think I'd like to just start with kind of thinking about Joe Biden's sort of decline and, sort of resignation from the race or withdrawal, I guess we were
hmm.
saying, from the race for presidency. Whatever he may have said, I think it's pretty clear that it's his cognitive problems that were at the root of why he was pushed out, right? Essentially. And I don't think we can really pretend that those cognitive problems just began the night of the debate, right? That's when they became obvious in a undeniable way. We
Hmm.
say there's already some evidence to this effect, but it became sort of indisputable, right? I mean, the poor
Yeah.
guy just couldn't even hardly put together
Yeah.
sentences sometimes. Um, so that raises a really interesting issue, especially in a constitutional federal republic, right? If he's deficient to run as president, right, then he was deficient to serve as president for a
Yeah,
time,
stands to
probably,
reason.
and is deficient because he hasn't resigned the presidency, right?
Hmm.
Um, so the weirdness of this is then that, well, okay, if he's really that deficient, and has been, let's say, we'll just be generous and say for the last 6 months, okay, and presently is deficient, such that he can't rule. Well, actually, who is ruling? Like,
Yeah,
who is in charge if the president, the person who was elected to be in charge, isn't in charge, then who is? Now,
right.
one obvious way that you could deal with this is to say, well, he's excessively senile or whatever it is, and so he resigns, right? And that would be a responsible thing to do. You say, I've found that I can no longer carry forth the office, and for that reason, I resign. And then there's somebody already designated as a successor, right? That is his vice president, Kamala Harris. I don't know why they haven't done that. That seems to me the responsible and right thing to do, which again then raises like, well, if the VP's not running things,
Then who is?
yeah, who
Yeah.
is?
So, so let me chime in on that whole thing. In Catholic tradition, right, as you know, the church doesn't sort of prescribe any particular governmental arrangement.
Right, right,
It does prescribe that we have governmental arrangements,
right,
right? That there is having a political community is sort of natural to human beings when you have, more than a couple of families living together in the
yeah,
same place. Well, but we can sort of arrange the kind of political community that suits us within certain moral boundaries, right?
right,
Um, and in this world, none of those arrangements is going to be perfect.
right, sure.
So, you could argue, well, this is more Catholic or that's a more Catholic arrangement, whatever.
Mhm.
At a practical level, though, we have an arrangement here, and
Mhm.
we can't just sort of pretend that it's not there.
Right,
Even if you advocated for something that you thought was more Catholic, that would be better. The
sure.
fact of the matter is, nonetheless, right now, the way things are, we have a political arrangement and it's got its rules.
Right.
So you're really not at liberty to just conduct political affairs outside those boundaries, right? You can't.
Sure.
And in the United States, according to our Constitution, there actually are provisions for what happens when a president becomes incompetent,
It's true.
right? And by incompetent, I mean non compos mentis, right?
Right.
Um, you remove him,
hmm
right? So there's a process for doing that,
Sure.
and it requires the cabinet to step forward and kind of declare it, right?
hmm
And then there's an opportunity for the president to respond and try to say, no, I'm not incompetent,
hmm
right? And then ultimately a judgment has to be made. But that procedure hasn't been enacted. Also, let's say that the president knows he's going to become incompetent,
Right.
right? He could and should voluntarily hand over
You're right.
the presidency, right? The duties of the office, whether permanently or only for a necessary time to the
Okay.
vice president, who then assumes it. That's how our system works.
Sure.
Um, again, that hasn't happened.
hmm Right.
So to go to your question, who's running things, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, we we kind of have an obligation to know the answer to that question.
Sure. Right.
Um,
And that person's supposed to be elected.
this person's supposed to be elected, right?
Right. It can't just
In
be
fact,
somebody that's appointed by the president.
right. So you have the president who's
Right.
elected, the vice president who's also elected along with him, right?
That's correct. Yes.
You've got the speaker of the house next in line
That's right.
who's also elected,
That's right.
okay? I mean, you go down sort of the list, and eventually you get to people who aren't
Sure.
directly elected,
Right. Right.
but they're still appointed by the president and approved by the Senate.
Right. Sure. Sure.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I would say this is a serious constitutional crisis that we're in right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah.
And again, the this is irrespective of whether you like Joe Biden, whether you support the Democrat platform or not.
Right. Right. Right.
The issue is the rule of law. The issue is
Yeah.
whether we're actually following our constitutional structure. Because
Sure. Sure.
if we're not, then all bets are off, right? I mean,
Right.
if we're not
Right.
following the constitutional structure, then where else are we not following the constitutional structure?
Yeah, I agree with that. And here's another sort of wrinkle to it, because somebody could say, okay, look, yeah, guys, I get it, but we only got a couple months here. We can eke this thing out uh to the next election. Maybe there's a little bit of caretaker bureaucracy going on in the background, but this is just a couple months. Let's not panic over this, okay? Okay, I'm a little bit of a realist. I could kind of s- maybe accept that, or at least think about it. But um, the broader issue maybe is this, that, or at least this is what makes me think about it, or what raises comes up into my mind is what they're really showing is maybe that the way things are set up is that frankly a president isn't necessary to run the
Oh yeah,
country.
I've been saying that for years. In fact, you
So,
may remember at a personal level between us that I thought that Biden was showing signs of senility before he
mm,
was elected
mm,
in 2020.
sure, sure.
And and I had said to you
Uh,
and a couple of other friends that this is a trial run for sort of the ultimate triumph of the bureaucratic administrative state where
right,
they could
right,
demonstrate that the president isn't actually necessary at all.
right, right, right.
And that is what actually seems to be. I mean that's the answer. If right,
Yeah,
so let
so you just are like, well, what has made the presidency irrelevant, right?
yeah,
What has, and I think,
the administrative state I think is what's made.
yeah, right. The administrative state, the deep state, however you want to talk about it. One really interesting book that I've just begun reading. I've read some other things by this author. There's an author named James Burnham
Uh,
who wrote a book called The Machiavellians, which is very interesting about freedom and power and the way government works. Um, but his most famous book is actually called The Managerial Revolution, right? And it is eye-opening and depressing uh,
mhm.
to read. And this was, written back, decades and decades and decades ago. But he was a, former Marxist who sort of saw kind of the idea of managerialism, right? Alistair McIntyre talks about this a little bit too, as sort of the new form of governance since really kind of early 20th century.
Mhm.
And that sort of it's kind of burgeoning more and more, right? Some, of course, thinkers sort of like this idea. There is a school, Hegelian school one of the Hegelian sort of offshoots in in Europe that sort of celebrates this idea, right? That is that actually, yeah, the managerial state is the next evolution, right? We don't need popularly elected, charismatic figures. In fact, they're actually kind of problematic. What we need are professional, technically well-trained managers who can manage the state in all its complexity for us.
Yeah. So
Rich, you're not persuaded?
I'm not I understand the argument,
Yeah.
but we can trace that line of thought back to the late 19th century, really.
Mhm.
And the experiments we've made with it just don't seem to me to have worked out very well.
Mm,
That's
mm.
my own view on it. I mean, the experts these days have a pretty bad track record, I just want to say.
They
You
saved
know,
us from COVID.
yeah, I don't
Sorry, carry on.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a meme I remember seeing not too long ago where it was like a scorecard,
Right.
experts. on one side and like conspiracy theorists on the other or something.
Right. You know, 0 to 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not really persuaded of that.
Mhm.
Um, but that's an interesting discussion though, because that comes down to this issue of whether, we can have a different political arrangement,
Mhm.
and whether that would be a legitimate political arrangement to have.
Sure.
Well, I mean, I suppose one could make the argument,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
There's a question on a theoretical level, is that an okay way to arrange things? Versus at a practical and prudential level, whether it really works out as well as we'd hoped.
Mhm.
Those are two separate questions, really.
Right.
But again, I return to the fact that that's actually not the system we're supposed to be living under.
That's correct. That's correct.
And and I'm a stickler for this, right?
Okay.
In fact, I'm even to the point where um, I'm sometimes backed into some uncomfortable positions from given my own views about things.
Hmm.
Um, the I'm a stickler for living by the system you have. Now, we actually do have provisions in the United States
Sure.
to alter our system to a greater or lesser degree, right?
Right. Right.
We
Right.
can we can amend the Constitution. But
Hmm.
until that action is taken, we're kind of constrained within certain rules.
Right.
And frankly, those rules don't really allow for the administrative state the way we have it. As far as I
Right.
could tell, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but we
Sure.
recently had a Supreme Court decision come down that
Yes.
overturned a
Yeah.
longstanding precedent, right?
Hmm.
Called the Chevron deference, right? It
Yeah.
overturned that.
They're
Now,
very
Chevron
important. Yeah.
deference
Yeah.
was a precedent that goes back to, I don't remember when, the 80s or something.
Hmm.
Um, and basically it was, if if the if Congress passes a law and that law is ambiguous, right? So in other
Hmm.
words, what it's actually prescribing for you to do is debatable. It's not really entirely explicitly clear, right? What it says to do or not do.
Right.
Um, the administrative agency that's entrusted with executing that law is um, is entitled to interpret it the
Hmm.
way it wants to,
Hmm.
right? That's Chevron deference. Well, that was recently overturned,
Right.
and basically the reason for that is that essentially turns the administrative state into another branch of government that
Right.
makes and enforces laws.
Sure. Yep. Yep.
Um, and
Very important.
that's unconstitutional, right?
Yeah.
That's not, and literally, it's not what our
Sure.
Constitution actually prescribes.
Right.
So that was overturned.
Hmm.
And that's a huge mix-up in the US today.
Yeah, it is. And you know, we just think about it like on the surface, it might sound like a reasonable arrangement to say, okay, well, don't exact like there's part of this law that we don't exactly know how to apply. So, you know, we're just gonna let this person kind of, you know, sort of do some sort of determination. But the principle that it moves against, right, is the sovereignty of the states and the people, right?
Right.
Which, you know, they're represented by the woeful legislative branch,
Yeah.
right? The senators and the House of Representatives. You know, there's a good, strong argument to make that Congress is really supposed to be the strongest branch of government, and especially the Senate. And sadly enough, right? And I think you could probably make the argument that the Congress is the weakest branch of government these days. Uh,
Yeah. It's pretty
but
weak.
yeah,
It's pretty
yeah,
weak. In fact, this is really interesting. So
right.
in the wake of overturning Chevron deference, um, a flurry of opinion pieces hit
Hmm.
hit the cycle, right?
Right.
And people were saying, um, the legislative branch doesn't really know exactly how to write laws under this new precedent, because like that won't get overturned.
Mm,
And I'm like, exactly. Okay.
right.
So basically what you've just uncovered is the fact that the whole process by which Congress has been making
Mm,
innumerable
mhm.
I mean, thousands of laws, right?
Right, right.
Um, each one thousands of pages long.
Mhm.
Okay. the very process they've been using to do that for the past several decades has just been a process whereby they're pushing responsibility into the administrative state. The whole process is about empowering the administrative bureaucracy.
Right, right.
And if that's not the
Mhm,
task for them, they
mhm.
just don't know how to do the task that they're actually
Right.
assigned by the
It
Constitution.
depends just a little bit, make this concrete. When we're talking about that, the administrative state, right? There are a lot, we think about the three branches of government, but in addition to three branches of government, right, there are a whole list of federal agencies, right? Now, to be sure, there are bureaucrats. I mean, no government's going to exist without bureaucrats or some administrators. And even in our Constitution, there are designated staffers, right?
Right,
Cabinet for the president and so forth of that nature. That's just part of good governance. The question is really the size, scope, and power, right,
right,
of the bureaucracy. And to make it concrete, we can talk about this in terms of federal agencies, right? So we have, in addition to the three branches of government that we learned about civics, we have, the Department of Education, right? We have the Department of Homeland Security. We have the department, like all these agencies, the FBI, the DEA, ATF, on and on, all these acronyms, right?
right.
One after we have the Environmental Protection Agency. There's all of these agencies, right? And these agencies, a lot of people don't realize this, but these agencies, under the current way things are run, have the right as applications, right, of congressional law to write binding rules, right, that are enforceable, right? And that's
Right.
the issue
And it can
that
carry the weight of a felony.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So that's very important to get those things, because again, it's one thing for Congress to make a rule, right? That's its
Yeah,
job.
that's in the Constitution.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that's always interesting about these things is there's limits, of course, on what the Congress can make laws about, right?
Hmm.
Well, there's nothing in the Constitution about the limits on what the DEA can do, right? Or the Department of Education. Do you see what I'm saying? Right.
Because the DEA isn't in the
That's
Constitution.
right, right. So you invent this thing, right, that's outside of the Constitution, right? And so it can kind of make rules in a more limitless way, right?
So this is an element too that we that I find personally really, really infuriating about it.
Mhm,
Um, so Congress creates these agencies
mhm,
and puts them under the executive branch. Now, when you look at the executive branch in the Constitution, it is the president,
mhm,
right? The executive branch is the president.
mhm,
Um, that's what it says. It's the executive branch is vested in the president. And and now these agencies come under the president, but to enforce laws passed by Congress. Well, that makes some sense because Congress passes laws and it's the duty of the executive to execute
sure,
the laws, right?
mhm,
Except that these agencies have a life that ultimately the president can't fully control.
right, right, yeah,
Right. And now what you've done is you've taken executive power from the president. So he
mhm,
stands by and watches, he can complain, but ultimately he's powerless to stop them from
mhm,
doing certain things.
mhm,
Um, and in fact, we saw clearly under the Trump administration
mhm.
that these agencies actually resisted the executive branch. They
Sure,
resisted the president
right.
and
And you
wanted
could say, in
to
theory, well,
undermine
if
him.
they work for the president, couldn't he just fire them all? And the truth, he probably could, right? But it would be an enormous scandal, an enormous controversy, for sure. Um, these things are, you should really think about these things as like departments or like little corporations or something, right?
Hmm.
They exist before any particular president comes into power, right? They have their own rules that are quite complicated, their own buildings, their own budget lines. They have their own patronage structures, right? Their own connections to corporations. many of which they're supposed to regulate. There's a notorious cycle between the companies that are supposed to be regulated by these agencies and the heads of these agencies, right? Lots of times, like they sort of, go from being a regulator into the corporate world, and then from the corporate world back. Very kind of lucrative setup. But they exist kind of on their own at this point, right? They have their own sort of internal institutional momentum, right? That makes it very hard to actually pull them in or eliminate them, right? You can't really eliminate them altogether because Congress has created laws that made them come into existence,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So you'd have to, there's different ways maybe you could attack that, but it's just important to recognize these things have their own sort of momentum and strength that makes it difficult for the president to actually control them.
Yeah, it would actually be an interesting test constitutionally if the president decided to dissolve an agency.
Mhm.
Um,
I don't know that he
because
could
that was
dissolve
created by Congress. Because he might argue before the court, right, that
it.
in creating the agency, Congress overstepped its bounds. That they could create the agency with a constitutional amendment, but without that amendment,
Mhm.
the executive branch determines how it's
Mhm.
structured.
Yeah,
Right.
that'd be
That would be the
interesting.
argument that I would want to advance. Of
Yeah,
course, again, I'm not a constitutional
yeah,
scholar,
right.
but you know,
Yeah.
I follow Supreme Court stuff.
Thanks closely. Yeah, I
Um,
think you could go that route. The other two routes you could go is to pass a budget that has no wages allocated to the department.
right,
Uh,
and then they sort of de facto have to close.
yeah, they just close.
Um, yeah,
Or
there
you
are
can
lots of other
fire
ways.
everybody in the department and refuse to hire anybody. That opens you up to wrongful termination. But if you could play that out in the courts for years.
Well, actually, one of the things that Trump had done at the very end of his presidency, which Biden immediately changed,
Mm,
or I think he had done it or just was intending to, but in any case, he plans to do it this time around, is to
mm,
reclassify those
mm.
jobs under federal law so that he can just fire them.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and um, and if you ask me, that's a good thing because I don't think that it. I'm not sure that most people really think about the extent to which the power of the administrative bureaucracy impinges upon liberty.
Mm,
And maybe in your day-to-day life, it just doesn't really seem to affect you. But I think in hidden ways it does. And one of the ways that it does is, well, I'll give you an example here where um, Tulsi Gabbard, right, who was once a congresswoman for she was in the House of Representatives in Hawaii, right?
mhm,
Um, so she was a Democrat at the time. She's since become an independent because she's come to see the Democrats as really enemies of liberty, right?
mhm.
And she recently discovered that she's on a terrorist watch list. So she gets put on a terrorist watch list by who? I don't know, the FBI, Homeland Security, one of these
Yeah,
agencies
yeah.
dropped her onto a terrorist watch list.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I don't know if she's still active as a reservist or in the National
Mhm.
Guard. I don't remember. She has a military
Sure.
background too. But unless they know something that I don't know, I can't. It's bizarre to think that Tulsi Gabbard,
Right.
you can have your political disagreements with her, but for crying out loud, a
She's a
terrorist
terrorist? Like, right,
terrorist
come
watch
on,
list?
right? Yeah, right. It seems ridiculous.
That's
Yeah,
absurd.
yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, that's so. I mean, I think that's a good example, and you know, I think once you start really thinking it through, it's pretty obvious how this sort of structure is problematic, just from a point of view of governance, because it seems to be behind the scenes so much of it's clandestine. And then second, especially for a ostensibly constitutional republic, right?
Hmm.
It nudges the constitutional republic in the direction of an oligarchy, right? Really,
Yeah.
if you use sort of classical terminology, right? And that's one of the things that's kind of, I think, come out and with more force in recent years. This event with President Biden sort of illustrating it is the degree to which there is this kind of pull towards oligarchy, right?
Yeah.
There are, and I kind of, again, being sort of on the realist side of things, there are any number of good political philosophers who espouse what they call the iron law of oligarchy, which I do sort of ascribe to, that just as a matter of empirical fact, uh, regimes tend towards oligarchy
Hmm.
regardless of their ideology, regardless of their structure, that they all tend in that direction, right? Which is a little bit pessimistic, but uh, these facts at least seem to testify that. Any of the other events that jump out to you that you would like to kind of look at from through a Catholic lens, Rich?
Well, so yeah, okay, so the first thing we were just talking about the structure of government and the current situation in the United States and how that raises issues of constitutional crisis, which
Mhm.
should concern us as Catholics, as people, but particularly since Catholics, we have a certain view on the moral obligations that we owe to the political structure.
Sure.
Um, it should be of concern to us, right?
Right.
Now, I also want to, I guess part of this whole discussion leads to issues of the way that politics tends to be framed.
Mhm.
And I don't know if this is one of the topics that you had in mind to talk about today, but the you mentioned earlier, right, that Kamala Harris is suddenly now that she's taken she's become sort of the Democrat candidate
Mhm.
for president. Um, how suddenly she's portrayed as this immensely popular figure.
Mhm. Mhm.
Historically, that's not true, actually,
Mhm.
right? So when she ran for president in 2020, she didn't get a single vote, like
Mhm.
not one delegate. Um, and
She
she
had to pull
dropped out
out
of the
before
race
Iowa,
very.
is that right?
What's that?
Did she have to pull out before Iowa?
She pulled, yeah. I think that's right. She was so immensely unpopular. She was going nowhere.
Right.
Um, and
Can I mention just one quick thing about that?
yeah,
That's just worth noting, and then you continue on. Uh, One of the reasons that she got KO'd so early, there were a couple of reasons, but one of among others is the criticism from the left of the Democratic Party about her time as a prosecutor
uh-huh,
in California. There were a good number of further left, we'll say, uh, sections of the Democratic Party that considered her to be top cop of California, and that's bad, right? In fact, they called her top cop uh,
uh,
behind the scenes because cops are bad, of course, in the Democratic
right.
Party.
Well, yeah. So,
Go ahead. Sorry.
right. Well, of course, once she became vice president, then she took a different stance, right? And
Mhm.
she actually advocated for continuing the riots that were going on in
Mhm.
2020, right?
Bailing out the rioters and
Bailing out the rioters, right? She actually supported that, told them to keep going, don't give up, right?
Mhm.
Um, but nothing to see here. I mean, that's not a problem. So, she was immensely unpopular, and she actually remains immensely unpopular. If you actually ask the typical person what their impression of Kamala Harris is, they, frankly, they find her obnoxious. And she, I mean, whatever, you have your own opinion about Kamala Harris, but the general public, it doesn't actually seem that there's this immense popularity. It seems to me that what you have is sort of narrative construction that, like, you'll notice she hasn't done press conferences. She doesn't do interviews. Not a whole lot going on in the way of campaign events. She appears occasionally sort of as an afterthought with some rappers or something. But like she doesn't do anything like what her opponent does,
Uh-huh.
where he just kind of goes out there, is himself, and attracts massive crowds, right?
Hmm.
She just doesn't seem to have that. Now, granted, her opponent also has tremendous unpopularity, just like she does.
Sure.
But it seems to me that she just doesn't have the positive popularity that he does, and that the narrative that she's really popular, that she's a breath of fresh air,
Hmm.
um, that's totally constructed. Am I wrong? That's just my perception, but
I think certainly manufacturing consent is an active part of 20th century, 21st century democracies, right? And the key technology for manufacturing consent is mass media, right?
right.
Uh, has been mass media. They're still good at it, I think. I think their narratives are sort of tinny, uh, so maybe they're not very good at it, but they're still good enough. Um, and then, of course, also social media is right, the new technology for manufacturing consent. Um, I do think that so. I think most people are front runners, Rich. That is, most people want to be on the winning side.
Uh,
And so if you keep getting told over and over again that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are the winners and are on the winning side, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That is that people will begin to think that they're great, right?
yeah.
Now I'm taking on a pretty gloomy view here of the of the citizenry, right? But I think the narrative create. So I put it this way: I don't think that at the get-go she was secretly super popular. I think the
Uh,
narrative creates the popularity
right.
and the favorability. Now again, it's
But
limited, and
it's
I
it's
kind of,
superficial, right? Because
yes,
it's
sure,
you're
I
just
agree with
glomming
that.
on to you're just accepting the narrative.
That's right.
You're not really in love with Kamala. You're just in love with the image of Kamala.
Sure.
Um, and no, it's funny because I remember this issue has come up. This issue's been coming up quite a lot. You know, the use of polls, for example.
Hmm.
Um, what purpose do polls actually serve? Well, maybe they take a pulse, or maybe they actually serve to advance a narrative, right? So
Hmm.
if you can take the right polls,
Hmm.
frame them in the right way, and get a result that you want from the polls, or if you could cherry pick from the polls, right?
Sure.
And show the polls that have, the outcome, she's winning, right? That helps you promote, that helps you
Uh,
actually lead to the very outcome
sure.
that you claim you're
Sure.
measuring
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this has been the case for a long time in a lot of different areas that media will deny this all the time, right?
Uh,
Mainstream media, mass media. Um, they'll say, we're just reporting. Or we're just reacting to um, the demand, the interest that's already there, as
yeah,
if mass media can't produce interest, right? If mass
yeah,
media couldn't produce interest, there'd be no such thing as advertising. There'd be no such thing as marketing, right? It's
right.
absurd, right? Obviously, you can create interest and desire, right? That whole idea, right, that that they're just kind of just reporting facts here, just neutral observer, right? No,
Yeah, let me give you an example of this very thing in action.
uh,
Elon Musk recently called out the social media companies, right?
sure.
Um, you do a Google search on um, assassination attempt of,
I
right?
heard about
Does
this. Yeah.
does Trump come up?
Right, right.
No, no. Well, what do you think, realistic? What do you think people are actually looking for right now? They're probably looking for Trump. I don't have to be some computer algorithm to figure out that the likelihood if somebody types in assassination attempt of, the next word is going to be Trump.
Hmm.
But somehow it's anything but, right?
Right,
So you go
right.
down this list and you just don't encounter stories about that. Well, Elon Musk totally called him out on this, right? It's
Sure,
obvious. It's an obvious attempt to sort of move interest in a particular direction.
sure. Well, we had congressional hearings that brought out, that a lot of that was going on um, during the pandemic, right? Um,
Oh yeah, right.
that like certain kinds of searches the were right suppressed, and certain kinds of information were put down at the bottom of the search, all that kind of thing, right? So anyways, yeah, I mean, I think that's demonstrated, right, that big tech can have that consequence, right?
Right.
uh
So
and
not only is it woefully naive to think that the press, that the media can't produce interest, it's
Mhm.
also grossly dishonest.
Sure, right, yeah, I agree.
Because they know not only do they do it and they know they do it, but they do it on purpose,
Mm,
right? You could see
mm.
that. For example, if you like anybody these days could just, download something from YouTube and just watch a montage of people from all over the news media, every
uh
network, right?
Sure.
Every show on the network
Mhm.
using the exact same turn of phrase,
Oh yeah, right,
right? I mean, you're going to tell me that's a coincidence?
right, yeah, yeah. It's
No, it's a
good.
script.
Just reporting the facts.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's kind of technology, and technology is never really neutral. There's always trade-offs, and it makes manufactured consent, right, um, a real possibility, right, to a greater degree, right, um, than maybe in previous regimes, right, or
Yeah.
under previous epochs in which information was disseminated in very different ways, and we have very different living patterns. So I do think that Vice President Kamala is enjoying a burst of popularity. I think a lot of it's kind of pent up, like left wing, like, oh God, we have to run with Biden, to like
Mhm.
at least this person is like, you know, moving around and not wandering off stage and all this sort of stuff, and for some reason some people find her interesting and energetic and attractive. So I do think some of that's genuine, but I think a lot of it's manufactured.
Uh,
Um, and I think, I mean, there is the truth that a lot of people, that some people will like voting for her because she's a woman and because she's a person of color. And it's like, allows you to not vote for a white male. So that's a plus to some people. But I do concede the point. I think a lot of it's manufactured by the narrative. And that's an interesting problem. I mean, there's an interesting series of interviews that were done in the 80s with Richard Nixon.
mhm.
And among some of the things he talks about in there is the power of the media, right? And of course, he very much experienced that himself,
Oh,
right?
right, right.
Um,
That was a
the
famous episode, right? When he, in American history, when he appeared on television,
mhm.
right, next to Kennedy, and everybody was like, he lost.
Yeah,
But on the radio, he won.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, that's where technology was not neutral, right? It was not, and it was not kind to Nixon, right?
Um,
But anyway, so it is a very powerful medium for sure, and seems to definitely, be problematic. I'm not sure from a Catholic ethical perspective, how would you address that, Rich?
so,
I mean,
yeah,
obviously, if you're going to have a democracy, you're going to need to have some sort of way of disseminating information so that
right,
people can be informed and, et cetera.
right. So, this is a difficult thing, right? Because so let me say something really unpopular first.
Okay.
And that is that historically, the Catholic Church has not embraced a blanket concept of freedom of speech.
Mhm.
Now, for various reasons, I want to say that I think policing speech at a pragmatic level is very difficult. And
Mhm.
I kind of lean in the direction that erring on the side of liberty and speech is preferable to stifling speech um, that you consider to be bad or dangerous, because human beings being as they are, even within the
Mhm.
church, um, I'm not sure that that those judgments can always be so well trusted.
Sure.
And we've seen historically that they've often led to very bad things. That said, in the United States, it's not a theocracy. It's not
Correct.
even a it's not even a Christian republic in the strict sense, right? Where it's the president of the United States does not pay fealty to the Pope, right?
Right.
That's not our arrangement. Um, and so I trust them even less do you know what I'm like,
Yeah.
all right. So frankly, I say err on the side of liberty. Um, and so I'll defend, the freedom of speech. Now, that being said, I think that there are various mechanisms at work in the United States that are not
Mhm.
about freedom of speech or the press. Um, and I think that some of these things have come up recently in cases that have gone as far as the Supreme Court. And
Okay.
I'm not really sure the court decided them in a way that was coherent to me.
Okay.
All right. So the we have a rule, right? It's like Section 230 of some code in the United States that protects social media companies from being treated as if they were from basically protects them from libel uh, as if they were publishers, right? So if you're a
Mhm.
publisher and you publish something that defames or grossly misleads about something really important, right? You could be found liable, right?
Okay.
So I publish something that I know to be
Sure.
false or I have no good reason to be true, to believe it to be true
Mhm.
about person X. Person X comes back and says, you defamed me. I could
Mhm.
be liable,
Mhm.
right? So we protect social media companies against that, saying they're not publishers.
Okay.
But in fact, they exercise editorial judgment all the time in determining what will or will not be
Mhm.
promoted
Okay.
or even allowed to be seen. Um, they can cancel people's accounts, right?
So
Erase
yeah,
them.
let's put a little flesh on this here. So let's talk about a publication, the National Review.
Right,
The National Review is a publication, right? It's a magazine,
right.
right? And it has, as a publication, it's allowed to be censorious, right?
Yeah,
Because it has a point of view,
right. And that's
right?
totally legitimate under the US Constitution.
Right.
To promote
And
your point of view.
likewise, what would be was it American Prospect is the left-wing version or something like that? But, they have a point of view. So, if I write an anti-abortion article and send it into, whatever, the Slate or the new,
Yeah, they're probably not going to publish it.
yeah, and that's within their right. They're a left-wing magazine, right?
But they can't publish that um, I don't know, they can't publish something that says you
Libelous, yeah.
plagiarized your doctoral
Yeah.
dissertation,
Right, right,
right?
right.
When that isn't true.
Correct.
Um, so the social media companies are protected from those kinds of suits
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
on the grounds that they're not actually publishers. They're just platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And my contention is, in fact, they behave as if they are publishers because
Sure.
they do make editorial judgments
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
same way that National Review does.
Right, right. Yeah,
Um,
it's an interesting, complicated issue, but go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, so they have a protection under the law that allows them to do all kinds of things, right? So basically, you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They the people who use the media don't get in their use of the media, they don't have blanket free speech,
Right.
but the company does. The company has control over it. and has no liability for the exercise of that control,
Yeah, it's interesting.
which seems to me to be a real problem.
Mhm.
And that I see as being a threat to the free exchange of ideas.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So, Rich, what about this? It seems to me that part of their maybe being considered a publisher is that they get the right to editorial oversight, right? So they can say, oh, well, this is misinformation, so we're not going to publish this, right?
Yeah, and I would say so. I would say yes, that's true, and that's why they are publishers and should be treated as publishers.
Yeah. What about we'll push a little different direction here, see what you think about this is speculative, but I've heard that actually that a contrary view is that they should be treated as common carriers. So that is they should be treated as like the phone company, right?
Right.
Phone company
Well, if you
does
want them to, if you want them to be immune, then yes. See, this is
right,
the thing, right? If we're
right,
going to allow them to editorialize,
right,
then we have to treat them as publishers.
right. That's
If
kind of
we
a thing.
say,
Yeah.
if we don't
Don't let
want
them
them, if we
editorialize.
want to protect them, then we have to treat them as carriers.
Right. Yeah. I think that's fair. And then you say, okay, you get no editorial control, but you have no liability, just like the phone
Right.
company.
That's the
Right.
deal.
Right. Yeah.
That's the deal.
Yeah. That seems to me fair and a fair sort of way of cutting it, and one that takes the finger off the balance, so to speak,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So you can't kind of put your finger on the weights and say, kind of load things in one direction, right? It's just, now there is this downside, right? Is it does create the kind of Wild West a little bit. Um, but kind of the same way the phone company does, right? The phone
Yeah,
company doesn't say communists can't use the phone lines,
right.
right? Um, and even if you thought that was a good idea, right? Like no, commies can use the phones, right? Um, and in the same way you would say commies can use the internet, right? We just can't sort of favor one side. So your sort of solution here to this problem, Rich, is that if I make sure I'm understanding you correctly, is that we need to remove the excessive power of editorializing of social media platforms.
Yeah, that's my view.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. It's interesting. Yeah. Good.
Because they do in fact control the flow of information,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like it or not, um, they have become the de facto public square.
Right. Right. Yeah, which pushes in the common carrier direction.
Right.
Right. I think
And you
so.
have to remember, right, what's the context of the First Amendment of the Constitution, right? The context of the First Amendment in the Constitution, which talks about freedom of assembly and of speech and of the press, was referring to the public houses in which people would pass around
Mm.
pamphlets and have
Right.
conversations, right?
Sure.
And the idea was that you can't kick them out of those venues for passing out publications. Now, the public tavern, the public house was owned by some guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a private business,
Sure.
but they're saying you can't shut them down,
Mm-hmm.
and people have to be allowed to go there
Interesting. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and speak freely.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
So
That's
it's a
good.
very similar context to the social
Mm-hmm.
media platforms today.
Right. Right. I know we've gone about almost a full hour here. I want to add one issue here, and then we can close up. And I know it's one that you wanted to talk about as well, Rich, which is the abortion issue
Yeah,
and issues related to abortion and sexual morality in general. I think this is especially acute. It's always something that comes up in American politics. It's especially acute since um, former President Trump was able to um, create a court that overturned Roe v. Wade, right? So that's brought abortion squarely back into a lot of debate, right? Not just as in kind of, well, maybe someday, these
yeah,
crazy people will be overturned Roe v. Wade, but they actually, it happened, right? The court overturned it. And now, of course, we have a much more lively debate around abortion because it is the case that now the states and the people can restrict abortion within certain areas,
right.
in certain states. Similarly, it's very important to recognize that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. I think it's fair to describe them, and I want to qualify this in a minute, as pro-abortion fanatics.
Yeah, I think that's
Uh,
accurate.
yeah, I mean, I think they're pro-abortion extremists.
Hmm.
Even in abortion, I think we could find some places where I would call somebody a pro-abortion moderate, right? So, for example, if you were open to restrictions on minors receiving abortions, if you were open to reasonable restrictions and maybe outline the last term abortion, right?
Uh-huh.
I would say you're wrong, right? Still, but I'd be like, okay, well, you're not a fanatic, right? You've got some sensibility here, right?
They're sort of like boundaries you're not willing to cross.
That's right, yeah. But that's just not the case with Harris and Walz. They are truly fanatics, and really, the Democratic Party has become more fanatical on this point since Roe v. Wade was
Oh yeah,
overturned.
even to the point where you can't actually get them to most of the leaders of the party, you can't actually get them to accept the idea that if a child were to survive an attempted abortion
Right, it
late
has a right
term,
to live.
that
Right.
that he would like
Yeah.
you have to give him care in the hospital.
I
They
could be wrong about this, Rich, but I think that there is a consensus, even among, or at least if not a majority, a large group of Democrats who are open to bans on third trimester abortions. That's the kind of consensus American position, I would say.
Yeah, right.
Um,
But it's
Now,
not
of course,
represented in the leadership of the party.
right, yeah. Obviously, as Catholics, we have a stronger view than that, but
Right.
it's important to recognize there are even nuances, right, on the other side.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to just factor bring in, and then we can talk about it theologically and philosophically, is it is also true that this time around, there has been, I would say, some turning down of the volume on abortion and we could call them sexual ethical issues
Yeah.
in the Republican platform. And there's some disappointment about that. I would probably share some of that disappointment, at least in sentiment. I do think that that has been duly addressed in public, but that is also part of what I think we'd have to kind of talk about in terms of a Catholic view here, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about sort of the importance of the rule of law. We've talked about fairness in the media, but I think so the abortion issue is always going to be an important one for Catholics. So, how would you begin to address that, Rich?
Right. So, the first thing I would say is um, understanding what happened when Roe v. Wade was overturned
Right.
is really critically important to sort of wrapping your head around this whole problem as it now presents itself to us. So, for about 50 years, we Catholics led the fight to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Hmm.
And we weren't the only ones, but we were the leading voice.
Yes.
And we continued to pass laws that would test Roe v. Wade, and one after another, they would get struck down. So we were able to make very, very little headway until we gradually seized upon an approach that started to gain a little bit of traction. And then with certain appointment to the Supreme Court under Donald Trump, we finally got some originalists on the court who have their own hermeneutic for reading the Constitution, right? Which is basically
Right.
to say, what would the, um, what does the text kind of say, and what would that text have meant to the people who had originally written it,
Hmm.
understanding the nature of the debates and problems of the time, right? So what was being addressed. That's very similar to the way a theologian, reads the documents of the
Sure.
church, right?
Yeah.
So the they overturned Roe v. Wade.
Hmm.
Now, from for decades, people thought Roe v. Wade was a badly decided precedent because it basically manufactures an argument, right? That doesn't really have anything to do with the Constitution.
Right.
And so it was struck down, rightly so. But that led what that led to was the question of abortion being remanded to the state legislatures. And so it's not a federal issue.
That's
under
right.
the Constitution. Here's the issue, right? It's
Right.
not a federal
Right.
matter under our constitutional structure.
Right. Right. Right.
It
Right.
could be if we amended our Constitution.
Sure. That's right.
Now, you might say, but Dr. Bulzacchelli, the audience might say, what about like, the 14th Amendment or something where it talks about persons born or whatever in the United States? Um, yeah, I'm thinking that if I used to think that way too, but I think if you really tested that against an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, you're
Hmm.
not going to get a prohibition of abortion out of that.
Hmm.
Um, the I would be happy to see a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion. I'm an anti-abortion extremist in that sense. I admit to that. But I don't think it's in our Constitution as it's currently written.
Hmm.
And so, like it or not, it goes to the states.
Hmm.
That's where the fight has to take place now.
Sure.
Um, my big criticism of the pro-life movement is that we had no plan for victory,
Mm.
right? The day we were as caught off guard as anyone
Yeah.
when Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Sure. Right.
Um, and we lost a lot of ground in the immediate aftermath of that decision,
Hmm.
where states that had previously been very pro-life suddenly turned around and pulled back. Um, that shouldn't have happened,
Sure.
but it did happen because we didn't have a plan. We were still thinking about the whole question at a federal level,
Right.
which was wrong. You were fighting for 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
turned it into a federal
I
matter.
think just, in a way, I think even some of the people who were involved, sometimes it's a little bit of sloppy thinking or not thinking it through as precisely as as needed, right? What Roe did was extend, right, in a way that's kind of parallel to, or this is their claim, the 14th Amendment, right?
Hmm.
It extended a constitute it discovered in the Constitution a constitutional right to privacy that extends to abortion, right?
Hmm.
So, the 14th Amendment famously extends federal constitutional rights to all citizens, right?
Hmm.
Prior to that, there's some question about the reach of constitutional rights, right? Vis-a-vis the states and so forth, right? Long arguments about that, but regardless. So what Roe did was extend a constitutional right to privacy to each individual citizen, which included the right to abortion, right? Now, of course, the arguments around the right to privacy, right, are a whole another thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so what the overturning that did, just like you said, was simply saying, no, there is no federal constitutional right to abortion, right? That's what overturning Roe did, right?
Yeah.
It left in place the possibility that there could be a state right to abortion. Do you follow me?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah.
That's what it did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and before Roe was passed, there was a mixture. Some
Right.
states
So now it's
had it
back to that
outlawed, some
situation.
states did not, right? And then there were some that had lots of limitations, some that had a few,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So it really just restored, right, that situation, right? Now,
Right.
again, we may not like that situation in the sense that we think it should be outlawed everywhere, but it is at least a step in the right direction. And one thing I
Our
want to,
mistake, our mistake as the pro-life movement was thinking that overturning Roe v. Wade was the end of the battle, that it was
right,
the victory.
mhm,
It wasn't,
right, right,
right?
right.
What that did was it laid the groundwork on which we could actually begin to make headway.
Correct. Yes, yes. Right. And I think as Catholics, we want to be sure to recognize that the church has told us explicitly in several different times that gradualism is a permissible position, right? So, and this is very important because I think sometimes very committed people will cut off their nose to spite their face,
Yeah.
to use the old saying, right?
Make the best the enemy of the good.
That's right. And you want to say, look, so let's say that you're in the House of Representatives and you get the opportunity to vote on a bill that says there will be no abortions on military bases,
Yeah.
right? But abortions may happen elsewhere, right? Under state laws, right?
Right.
Where the state laws permit. Well, you might say, hey, I'm against abortion, so it's got, I can't allow this provision that state laws allow for this to happen, right? And so I can't
Yeah.
vote for it. No, you vote for something that advances the good,
Yeah.
right?
So basically the situation on day one is abortion in this scenario. Abortion is permissible in these states
Right.
and on military bases in those states.
That's right.
On day two, if we pass this law, abortion will still be permissible in those states, but no longer on military bases in those states. Is
That's
that a
right.
win?
Sure.
That's a win, right?
That's a win. Yeah, that's a win. And it's very important to recognize, I think, and this is something that sometimes, we're not so good at recognizing. Politics is politics, and then sort of more deeply, sort of political discourse, and then sort of more deeply culture, right?
Uh,
These things take time sometimes. Sometimes they don't, but often they take time. And there's a momentum at work, right? And so, making these small steps, right,
mhm.
changes the conversation over time, right? And begins to sort of block out abortion culture, abortion language, the default permissibility of abortion. Do you follow me, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you think about a major institution like the United States military. Now, certainly, unfortunately, the military has declined in its cultural status to some degree in the last decade. But it still is the case that, the American military is an important institution in the institutional life of the United States of America, one that's highly respected still by many, many people. Seeing it change there is a significant step, if you made that step. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mhm. Right.
Um, that's one of the reasons that left-wing social movements have often targeted the military,
Oh, right.
right,
Yeah.
as
To be
one of their
laboratories of social
places to change
experimentation.
things.
To be laboratories of social experimentation, right? So
Right.
they
Yeah.
to opening up transgender to the military where, any doctor will tell you dependency upon hormones, right, is going to make you you're not battle ready. You can't be deployed.
Right. Sure.
That's why if you're diabetic, you get kicked out of the military, right? Sorry, but
Right.
we can't.
Yeah.
That's not what we're in the business to be doing.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Um,
So I would just encourage people when they're thinking about this issue, right? Um, Look, yeah, I mean, I think what Rich is saying is correct, right? Would we want a constitutional ban, right, on abortion? Sure. But what we have has been a step in the right direction, right?
yeah,
And it lays out for us a strategy, which is that we need to win in the states. I think myself, for the time being, right now is not the time strategically.
yeah. Strategically, if you ask,
Mm,
am I likely to win that battle?
no,
No. And what would happen if I lost it?
you might take steps backwards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big, conceivably really big, catastrophic
Yeah,
steps
it's
backward.
better does that mean I want to surrender? Absolutely not. I want to every pro-life group needs to work together to strategize taking over states, right?
Yeah,
And the way you do that, if you're smart, is you go for the low-hanging fruit
right,
first,
right.
right? You
So
concentrate your resources
yeah,
into Missouri, into Indiana, right? Into places that have a strong pro-life,
they're already 90% on board.
right? Yeah. You just want to push them over that edge, eventually building up to where, two-thirds of the states
Right.
are
And now
either
the other guys
outlaw
start to
or
look like
restrict.
outliers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. You make them the marginal extremist,
Right.
right? Um,
Which in fact is what they are, right? When you
tr-
think about it. As you were pointing out before, the
mm,
typical American view,
right.
which is not restrictive enough for me, But the typical American view is really first trimester only, and rape and incest exceptions. That's the typical American view.
Right, right, yeah. And that's something from a legislative point of view. Like if you're trying to push this in, I don't know, Indiana or somebody like that, okay, it's not all that we want, but it's a step in the right direction, right? And I think just change the conversation,
Right.
to a great degree. So I would just encourage, don't be discouraged, right? It's just we're in a different strategic situation, right? Than we were, and we just need to adjust our efforts.
So what if the presidential candidate who brought you during his prior term the overturning of Roe v. Wade, thanks to certain judicial appointments, were to then say that he does not seek a federal ban on abortion? What would be your response? But just
I would say, for the time being, that's fine. We work harder in the states, because you know what the other position is.
Yeah, you know what the other position is.
The other position is, let's make it a federal right through Congress.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that the current opposition would go for that. So I think what you want is status quo, right? Keep it at the state level for now, right? It's fine. Maybe we push something with the military that you could kind of pull that off a little bit more easier, right? But I think that's where you want to keep it for the time being, right?
The way to think about it, I think, is that overturning Roe v. Wade was like in the course of the prosecution of a war, right? Overturning Roe v. Wade was one of those watershed moments, right, in which the whole tide of the war turns. But the war is far from over.
Sure, it's like landing at Normandy.
Yeah.
Right. You're at D4, right? So you're day 4, you've gotten off the beaches, right? But you still have a lot to go, right? A big change has happened, but now the battle is going to be really different, right? It's not going to be this huge naval surprise attack. It's going to be fighting village by village, town by town, across all of France and part of Germany,
Yeah.
And that's a different war.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where we are now. And I think we should consider it a success to have gotten that far.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. Well, good. Well, I think those are all good topics. There's obviously a lot more that we could touch on. Maybe we'll loop back around and talk about some of those another time.
Yeah, check out our content. Subscribe to us on Patreon and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And you might want to read Dr. Smith's book on politics.
Yeah.